Oh, oh, all right. Okay. All right. So we are 130 members around the country, and the organization has been working on food and federal farm policy for the past 30 plus years. We have members in Montana. Some of them are national organizations. Some of them are a little bit more local. So the Montana Organic Association, for example, based in Missoula, the National Center for Appropriate Technology that has a center in Butte, and the Alternative Energy Resources Organization in Helena are all members of NSAC. Have issues with forwarding. There we go. Okay. And what we do is we work with those member organizations, but also when we're in a farm bill cycle like we are right now, we do a lot of listening sessions ourselves. So both our members and we will set up opportunities for farmers to get together and discuss some of the policies that they think need changing for the next cycle. And so we do a lot of listening, we do a lot of conversation with our members. So we have monthly meetings with different issue committees. I run the climate change subcommittee, and we talk about issues in those spaces, and people in our member organizations often are bringing farmer concerns from the ground. So we get to combine those member perspectives with the direct farmer feedback we get at listening sessions. And then all of that gets fed up into our policy development. And our policy development here at NSAC is specifically oriented toward federal policymaking. And we use what farmers and extensionists and other folks tell us in order to inform what happens, particularly in the next farm bill, as we're going to talk about. And one of the things we've put a lot of emphasis on over the last 6 or 7 years in particular is thinking about the historical context of things. So I just want to frame a little bit of that for you because it's a big part of the way we think about our policy these days. So we take that historical context of how the Farm Bill came about, and we try to think about what we need to rethink in terms of how the Farm Bill emerged out of history because of the history of the Farm Bill relying on stolen land, all that indigenous land that through unfair treaties, violated treaties and so forth, and through the Homestead Acts resulted in the loss of indigenous land, combined with the fact that a lot of the labor that agriculture was built upon in the United States came from stolen African labor. So we look at both of those pieces, and we are especially looking at all of that because of what happened in the New Deal era. So, you know, we all know the New Deal came about because of the combination of things that were happening between the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. We're trying to ensure that everybody has access to enough to eat, has access to income, that farmers are able to stay and work on their farms. And all of those policies got us to a lot of effective supports for people, but there were some groups that were explicitly and intentionally left out. So domestic workers and farm workers at the time were predominantly people of color, and it was a very specific intentional choice to leave out a lot of the supports for those populations in the Farm Bill policies that were developed around the Great Depression. And so we're still dealing with that legacy today, which is part of why we like to make sure to talk about this history, partly because when the USDA offices were first implemented, a lot of intentional discrimination happened in those offices, partly because of some of the local control that was allowed to go forward unhindered with legacies of discrimination. And here's the reason why we still focus on this. So if we look at programs like the Conservation Stewardship Program, we see that a lot of that legacy is still affecting farmers today. So I'm gonna have to move my view of all of you to see my bar over on the far right side. So if you can't see the far right side, you may wanna move folks as well. But over there on the far right, you can see that 0% in the red up to 10+% in the green is what the indicator is giving us. And what that's showing us is the percent of land that's controlled by what USDA calls socially disadvantaged farmers, essentially farmers of color, in the Conservation Stewardship Program. So most states, you can see, had 0 acreage in the Conservation Stewardship Program that was controlled by farmers of color as of 2018. We have a few exceptions. Certainly New Mexico is a significant one there, with 26% of acreage rather in the control of farmers of color, but lots of lack of access to programs by farmers of color. So that's the reason that we at NSAC are still, and actually much more, focusing on this legacy these days. All that said, we've had some substantial victories. We've got set-asides for farmers of color in the conservation programs, 5% for beginning farmers and ranchers, 5% for socially disadvantaged farmers, again, the USDA term, for EQIP and for CSP programs. We have the outreach and assistance for socially disadvantaged and veteran farmers and ranchers, or Section 2501. So the program that helps to offer all kinds of education and training, enterprise development to farmers of color and immigrant farmers as well. And then we have the nutrition programs and the healthy food access programs, both of which are not only helping to ensure that everyone gets fed in our schools, for example, but in addition, they buy a lot of produce from farmers of color. So they kind of have multiple purposes. So we have lots of good that's happened, lots of improvement, but we at NSAC are trying to make sure we're still thinking about how we uphold systems of oppression in our own food systems work, the resources or skills that we have access to and how we're using those resources, and who gets left out. So all of those are questions that underlie all of our Farm Bill work. And for example, when we're thinking about the conservation programs, we're always trying to think about how to do things like the set-asides a little bit better than we did in the last Farm Bill. Which brings me to the Farm Bill. So you all know this is a big piece of legislation. It sets the rules of the road for what food and agriculture does in the country for about 5 years at a time, if it passes on time, as it doesn't always. And it contains policies, programs, and funding for everything to do with food and farming. And what that means is it shapes what we eat. And that's because, as you probably are also quite aware, it affects the kinds of commodity crops that get support, and therefore which crops are cheapest for us to buy, often the crops that get the most processing. And so it changes very much what our diet looks like. It also, of course, changes the landscape for all of you, the nation's farmers. So it does that through all of those pieces of the toolkit that you see here. So conservation is a big piece of that, and that's the piece that I tend to work on the most. Infrastructure is another piece, along with innovation and research. So all of those pieces that help to make the landscape of what new farming will look like in the future. It affects jobs in agriculture. It affects the farm safety net. So the credit systems, the insurance systems that support farmers, all of those are part of what's built into the Farm Bill. And so because the Farm Bill affects all of those things, it also shapes our environment, shapes whether or not our waterways are clean, and it also directly shapes our economy because it's putting a lot of money into the agricultural system, and all of that ends up coming back into the economy as a whole, of course. And if we look at how it breaks down by money, you can see that a lot of the Farm Bill, so out of the 2018 Farm Bill, 428 billion, 3/4 of that was for nutrition, for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So it's a big, big piece of what the Farm Bill contains. And that other 3/4, most of that at least, is what NSAC deals in. So we work in conservation. Me and another colleague, he works conservation, energy, environment. I work on the climate pieces. And so we focus on that blue piece of the pie. Other parts of NSAC work on the commodities program in different ways, not super significantly, but we have one staffer who works on credit and crop insurance. And so that crop insurance piece is a pretty substantial part of what he works on. But you can see that those three things really make up the majority of what the Farm Bill spends money on. So conservation, commodities, and crop insurance, outside of the pieces that are focused on nutrition. Everything else, the research, the horticulture, the forestry, rural development, all of that gets taken into that tiny little, relatively speaking, 1%. Though, as you can see, it's still $4.2 billion, so it's not chump change. And then how all of that gets put together is framed by the good old process of the bill turning into a law. So this is the theoretical way everything is supposed to happen. You get a bill in the House, you get a bill in the Senate under heavy discussion through first the House and Senate Agriculture committees. And so that's the folks that we tend to talk to a lot here on the Washington end. And once they've developed versions of the bill, it goes out to the floor, it gets debated, something will get passed, it will go into conference committee. And in conference committee, the Senate and the House will decide what stays and what goes from each version. And often there's a lot of change, a lot of exciting changes. For example, from the Senate version of the bill were lost in conference committee last time. A lot of useful conservation changes just got erased in the conference committee when it was away from the view of the full chambers. And then it goes back out to the House and the Senate for each to vote on the floor on that final version that's been decided between both. And then if both houses pass it, it goes to the president's desk and gets signed. And all of that means that there are a number of people who are really important in this process. So the congressional committees that we tend to focus on the most, as I mentioned, are the House Agricultural Committee and the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Those are really where we do the majority of our work, with the exception of our staffer who works on appropriations. And he works with the Agricultural Appropriations Subcommittee of each of the appropriations committees. And then, of course, the whole Congress matters, the president matters, but the thing that we like to make sure to highlight is all of this happens because of that on the ground policy influence that comes from farmers, that comes from extension folks, from researchers, everyone on the ground that gives feedback to Washington that can help to shape what the Farm Bill ends up looking like. And one of the places where you all have influence is particularly in the appropriations area, because John Tester, who used to sit on the Senate Agriculture Committee, now sits on the Senate Appropriations and specifically the Agricultural Subcommittee of Appropriations. And so he has a fair amount of influence on how much money from the policy-making part of the Farm Bill gets allocated on an annual basis. So that's a process that's happening right now, is the appropriators are determining how much will get assigned for fiscal year 2023. We just finally, last week got 2022 squared away, even though we're halfway through fiscal year 2022 at this point. But Chester has some substantial influence there, partly because of his background as a farmer. So an important person for you all to have some influence over in turn. And so one of the things we like to remind everyone is that what we're doing is getting feedback oftentimes and trying to share that to the people that we're trying to influence on the Hill, trying to get more sustainable agricultural policy, better soil health, that sort of thing. And so one of the things you all can do is organize as a group with the Northern Plains Resource Council, with other organizations in the area to try to influence policy. And in the next year, make sure to talk to your, not just to Tester, but to other folks in the House, to people who may not even be your representatives, but who sit on Senate Agriculture or House Agriculture. Talk to them about what you'd like to see in the next bill. And if you do that individually and as an organization, it sort of doubles and sometimes quadruples your impact, especially because organizations, when there are multiple sets of people really giving their feedback, can have a good influence. Okay, so that's sort of the overview of the Farm Bill itself. I'm going to come back to it briefly at the end, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the things that are in the Agriculture Resilience Act. I understood from Gusty that you all are pretty familiar with the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Is that right? Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to talk about is instead the pieces of the Agriculture Resilience Act that changed some things for, especially for soil health and grazing, were what I concentrated on. There's a lot else in the ARA that I'm glad to talk about if you'd like, but the things I'll highlight here are that in the Conservation Stewardship Program, it puts soil health enhancement and greenhouse gas emissions reductions as criteria for ranking proposals. So that's a substantial new piece of how CSP contracts get chosen. So if that were implemented, it would mean that every CSP contract had to pass some sort of climate muster in terms of getting chosen. Another soil piece of the ARA is it creates grants for state and tribal soil health projects. There's been a lot of discussion from our members that in their states, they have these state initiatives that are doing a lot for soil health, but are often very underfunded, that they're trying to make some good changes at the state level, but they're hindered by that funding piece. And so the ARA creates state grants and tribal grants in order to cover that need. One of the other pieces that the ARA attacks is an EQIP. Under EQIP, 50% of the funding is allocated to livestock. That's just set in the legislative piece of how EQIP was created. So not something that USDA can change on its end, but how that 50% gets used, as long as it's applied to livestock, is flexible on the USDA end. The ARA makes it specifically assigned to advanced grazing management. So 2/3 of that 50% of the EQIP funding goes toward advanced grazing management, rather than, as most often happens with that 50%, going toward concentrated animal feeding operations. So it's a big push away from CAFOs and toward advanced grazing. And the Act as well prioritizes advanced grazing management for EQIP, putting it that with that inclusion of management intensive rotational grazing as an element of advanced grazing management as one of the priorities within EQIP. Another thing in the ARA that we've just gotten change on as far as appropriations is concerned is the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but it's just been lying dormant essentially for a number of years, aside from a conference that came out of the initiative. And we got, I believe it's $14 million for that initiative in this year's appropriations, the year 22 appropriations. And we're pushing to get more in the 2023 appropriations so that some more grazing lands practices can be spread. And this GLCI initiative is aimed at improving soil health, grazing system resilience, transitioning from confinement to grazing, and it includes some pieces for research and education, extension, outreach, all that sort of thing. So it's a good move that we've already gotten in appropriations. The ARA would actually put $60 million annually toward that initiative as well. And I'll add, I put it here at the bottom. This is legislation that was introduced in 2020, reintroduced last year, and it's a marker bill, which means we expect it to be taken up into the Farm Bill if possible. So the more support we can get for it in the House and the Senate, the more likely these provisions get taken to the Farm Bill. They're not intended to be signed as an independent bill, but rather just made part of that larger omnibus. A few other things that the ARA does is increase the CRP acreage cap. And at the same time as it does that, going from 28 to 32 million acres, it also has a pilot program to ensure that grasslands at risk of conversion to cropping or development, or those that are exiting the CRP and CRP grassland initiative, get taken up into a longer term CRP of 30 years and get annual payments for that long-term span. So trying to ensure that grasslands that really need to be protected can stay within CRP for a longer period of time. And this is a rather different piece, but under federal crop insurance, the Natural Resources Conservation Service conservation practices are not currently necessarily considered to be good farming practices. So that affects whether or not you can access insurance. That affects what feedback you get on whether you can get payouts with your insurance. And under the ARA, all NRCS conservation practices would be deemed good farming practices. And so it would take away a lot of the headaches of using NRCS conservation practices and bumping up against insurance problems. This would make it so that regardless of what you do, if it's NRCS approved, it's also Risk Management Agency approved. Okay. Let's see, I think this is the last policy bit I wanted to tell you all about. So Cathy mentioned you all were interested in the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, maybe applying for it. So I just have a little bit of an overview here, and I'm glad to answer other questions as best I can. First of all, just the pieces that they've really emphasized in both meetings that they've had on it and also in all of the printed materials available. You really need to focus on marketing a climate-friendly farm product. Climate friendly is what we say. We don't say climate smart here at INSAC generally, but climate smart is what USDA says. They ask you to track and verify your climate outcomes. So whatever your project is, you have to be able to verify that you're somehow reducing greenhouse gases, whether that's through emissions reductions or sequestering carbon. And then for the 2 different deadlines for the proposals for the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, there's the first set of proposals that are the bigger money proposals up to $100 million, from 5 to 100 million. For those that are due May 6th, they're looking at the top criterion for evaluating whether a proposal is likely to be picked, that there are verified greenhouse gas emissions reductions and carbon sequestration. So they're looking that your measurement is there, that you know that you're going to get reductions. They want that very clear for that proposal. For the June 10th proposals that are smaller, that go up to $4,999,999. Those are asking for a stronger focus on equity. So that can be things like involving minority serving institutions in your measurement and verification. It can be involving small and mid-scale farmers. It can be involving farmers of color. So all of these things focused on equity are the top criteria. All of them, however, require that focus on reducing emissions and creating a marketing product of some kind. And one thing I wanted to bring to your attention, just in case you all haven't seen it, is that there are some webinars coming up for which you have to register by March 28th, which is in a few days. And those are opportunities to meet other folks in case you're looking for partners on a grant. So if you just go to the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities website, you'll see these listed on the front page right now. But if you are thinking about applying for something and you think you may want additional partners, this is going to be a great place to look. Caveat that they said they're going to close each of these registrations as soon as the registration for a given session gets up to 200 people. So kind of a as early as possible thing to take advantage of. So the last thing, I forgot, I do have one more policy-ish piece. I don't have a lot of information for you on regional partners and funding because I think, for one, I think you all probably have better sense of that than I do, but I talked to one of our NCAT members and he offered a couple of things. One is this partnership between NCAT, Climate Hub, and Montana State. They're working on a pasture range and forage index insurance to help sustain ranching through droughts. So it's part of this larger project that they just recently got funded for. And that same project is going to include fellowships for extension efforts on grazing issues, so that there may be an opportunity to get somebody in there and get some, extension going as part of that project, even as they're developing the research on what the insurance should look like. And then he also highlighted that Montana and RCS, because you all have a sort of local led initiative on what CSP and EQIP should look like in your areas through the targeted implementation plans, there's a little bit more support for grazing and drought in CSP and EQIP than there might be in other regions of the country. I hope that's helpful. If it's, I would be very glad to hear from you all and what you're using and what you're finding helpful on your end.
Wow, Cathy.
I'll just run through this last bit and I'll hear from you all. So we're going to be working on compiling all our feedback. We're almost done with our listening sessions. We kind of do that through the winter, and once the growing season starts, we've sort of wound down. So we're starting to work on what the policy looks like, but we're still building it. It's definitely not set in stone yet. So we're even if you're not a member, we're interested in hearing what you think needs to happen, especially because I think we're often underinformed about the Mountain West, at least in the climate change subcommittee, that's the case. So I'd love to hear anything on that. And there's our information. And I'll note that we send out an update called the Weekly Roundup every week, and it has an overview of anything that's come out on our blog posts, like my blog post on the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, for example. And it also has information on interesting readings. That has updates on what's come out generally with INSAC for funding, that sort of thing. So it's a useful thing to sign up for. So when you get on the website, you can just search for the Weekly Roundup and it'll take you to a place where you can sign up for it. But as I said, you also should feel free to email me if you have any questions, follow up, recommendations, whatever. All right, so that's all I have, and I'd love to hear your questions, thoughts, whatever.
Okay, great job, Cathy. And so, yeah, so let's take a few questions. I'm sure there are some.
Steve?
Yeah, so at our last soil task force, we just gotten out of a really great NRCS conference that was focused on regenerative farming and had great speakers there, had a huge turnout, people interested. But the frustrating thing is, NRCS has really come a long ways on kind of promoting regenerative practices. But kind of when you get down to the actual programs, there's just lots of roadblocks and contradictions, and it's understandable because it's a huge organization, and and there's lots of different things. But how can we get it better, I guess, is the big question. And in the regenerative ag movement, there's a lot of really smart, brilliant people, producers and consultants. And if somehow some of these programs could be run by some of these people, and is it going to be helpful? Whenever I kind of apply to one of these programs, I'm fairly innovative, and almost always there's either a roadblock or they require me to do things that I don't think is the right thing to be doing. Say, for example, with crested wheat grass, and they'll say, well, you should spray it. I don't want to spray it. Well, you should cultivate it. Well, I don't want to cultivate it. And then I've actually done some practices that I'm experimenting with that I've seen, haven't done either one of those things, and I'm seeing some good things happen. But none of those things they would even kind of consider funding, because they're they just don't fit in with how they